Why is it that bookmakers won't take big bets on fights today? Do they worry about the fights being fixed? What are they worrying about?
They worry, I would imagine they worry about fights being one-sided. I don't know as far as being fixed, but some of the fights are total mismatches, and they really wouldn't want to get involved in the action of it.
And there's no way to establish odds, is that right, when you got a mismatch?
Well, they do, but they won't take big money. They'll take small money, 1,000, 2,000, maybe 5,000, maybe even 10,000 if you find a fairly large bookmaking operation. But I really don't believe that they would go overboard in with bets on.
When did that change? What time period? And what caused it to change?
I
They've
would
always
imagine
been one-sided fights, have they not?
But I would imagine that they walked away. When we walked away, when organized crime walked away from the boxing industry, I believe our betting slowed down. I believe the whole thing stopped in that area.
When did organized crime walk away from the boxing industry?
In the time when Rocky Marciano and people like that were involved, our people, meaning mob people, were involved, and we had closer ties to boxing, and I would imagine there was a lot more betting and a lot more situations.
Of course, that's a Fugazi. For real? That's a Fugazi? How do you know it's a Fugazi? You looked at it for 2 seconds. It's a fake. But, yeah, I know what a Fugazi is. Hey, pal. You want to see something?
We have to start by talking about Frankie Carver, who is known as the Khazar of boxing because of his control of boxing behind the scenes. Carver was born in 1904 in the Lower East Side of New York. Carver had lots of troubles at an early age as he was sent to a New York State reformatory for juvenile delinquents. At the age of 20, he faced murder charges after shooting a man in a dispute over a stolen taxi cab. After serving 20 months, he was released and hired as a gunman for various gangs while on probation. He began working for Murder Inc., and in 1931, Carver was charged with the murder of a Philadelphia mobster, Mickey Duffy, in Atlantic City, but was eventually released. When the Brooklyn mobsters and former Murder Inc. agreed to testify against Carver, one of the more important testifiers mysteriously died by launching himself through a window at the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island. This caused for the case to be dismissed. There's even a rumor that he was a leading suspect in the still unsolved assassination of Busy Siegel in Beverly Hills, California. Busy Siegel had built a hotel in Las Vegas with the money he made from gambling in New York City and failed to honor his agreement with his creditors. This resulted in the hit being put out on him. Busy Siegel was shot 4 times, twice in the head and twice in the torso. According to a New York State journalist named Larry McShane, he believes that the Siegel hit was carried out by Carver and was set up by Siegel's childhood friends. During the 1940s, Carver became involved in boxing to make more money after his probation. He was able to get his foot in boxing through Mike Jacobs, who was head of Madison Square Garden at the time and the most successful promoter in the United States. Mike Jacobs took a gamble on Joe Louis, in which many promoters at the time wouldn't have represented a young black heavyweight. Jacobs believed in Joe Louis, and he knew he would dominate the heavyweight division, which would give him more power. That ended up being the case. By 1947, Joe Louis had established himself as the best fighter in the world. Joe Louis became the longest reigning world heavyweight champion at any rate in the history of the sport of boxing, holding the title for over a decade and successfully defending it 23 times. Jersey Joe Walcott was next in line for a shot at Joe Louis and immediately being a huge 10-1 underdog. At Madison Square Garden, the fight was about to be an upset as Joe Louis walked into a counter right hand and hit the deck. Jersey Joe continued to out-jab Joe Louis and used some of his good footwork. Jersey Joe was told by his corner in the final 3 rounds that a victory was in the bag and not to get knocked out by the champ. Before the decision was announced, Joe Louis was seen attempting to exit the ring, disgusted with himself. However, the decision was given to Joe Louis as the crowd erupted. This led people to believe that the fight was fixed. And with the Mafia being involved with Mike Jacobs, Joe Louis' promoter, we can assume that the judges were indeed on speed dial. Joe Louis, after his boxing career, with the help of his lawyer, Thurman Gibson, formed a promotional company and quickly signed the top 4 heavyweight contenders, which included Ezzard Charles, Jersey Joe Walcott, Lee Savoldi, and Gus Lenovich to exclusive contracts after he relinquished his title and announced a tournament to replace him as champion. This is where James D Norris entered the picture, which his empire was passed on to him from his father, which included real estate, hockey teams, racehorses, and sports stadiums. He also owned a percentage of Madison Square Garden. Norris had the funds to make this Joe Louis strategy and transition work, and in 1949, Norris gave Louis $150,000 and a yearly salary of $15,000 in return for the contracts of these 4 heavyweights. Norris then bought out the remaining East Coast promotion competitors and ailing Mike Jacobs. Norris signed for some TV contracts with multiple networks but got jammed up by boxing managers. So this is when he reached out to Frankie Carver for some help to keep his television dates filled. This is how Frankie Carver got his start and ended up becoming a powerful figure controlling the fight game from behind the scenes. Carver controlled some of the fighters and put in fixes for some of these fights. Bear with me, guys. I'm going to mention a lot of names here. When Kid Gallivan fought Billy Graham, it was a close fight that saw Gallivan get the decision. Gallivan was controlled by the mob, and it was said that the judges was told to give the nod to Gallivan if the fight was close. Another fighter named Saxton was managed by a guy named Blicky Palomar, who ended up being the famous partner of Frankie Carver. After losing his title to Tony DeMarco in 1955, Saxton would regain it in a 1995 match against welterweight champ Carmen Bacedo, another fight considered to be fixed. It was even said that Frankie Carver arranged for Jake LaMotta to take a dive against Billy Fox. Jake LaMotta, the days leading up to the fight, was a huge favorite over Billy Fox. He had just defeated the great Sugar Ray Robinson a couple years prior and won 19 of his last 22 fights. However, strangely, the odds flipped and the bookies stopped taking bets on Fox. And 3 hours before the fight, you could have only bet on LaMotta. LaMotta never looked himself in that fight and allowed Fox to hit him with many shots with no resistance whatsoever. The referee ended up stopping the match. This is when conspiracies started to swirl in the boxing world, which said that LaMotta showed no effort to win this fight at all. It took 13 years later for the truth to come out, and in 1960, when the Tennessee Senator Eustace Kenovia had several hearings to expose the Mob's power over professional boxing. LaMotta was his star witness. At the hearing, LaMotta took the stand and told the truth about his involvement in fixing his 1947 fight against Fox. He told them everything about working with the Mob to throwing the fight, and included what he wanted in return. In fact, LaMotta paid the Mob himself $20,000 for his own self to take his own dive because he wanted a shot at the middleweight title and knew the Mob was his way of getting it. In return for throwing the fight and paying the $20,000 to the Mob gave him a fight against the then middleweight champ, Marcel Sauter. LaMotta ended up winning the fight and becoming the middleweight champion. Carver wasn't controlling the boxing arena alone, as he ended up meeting and working with Blinky Baltimore. Blinky Baltimore had a similar resume of violence as Frankie Carver. Baltimore committed at least 18 crimes between 1957 and 1969. His older brother, Fred Baltimore, shot former welterweight TV star Jimmy Floyd during a dispute over money. Somehow, Blinky was able to apply and successfully receive a boxing license to manage fighters. Together, Blinky and Carver will rule the boxing world by staging fights while intimidating anybody who didn't want to go along with their plans. Carver would give the orders and Baltimore would carry them out, sometimes violently, doing beyond what was asked of him. Carver, Baltimore, and their two other assistants will sit at a table in the classy Toots Show Bar and decide the fate of the world's top boxers. This meant to get to the top, unless you were truly the best talent out there, it was about who you knew. And if you wanted to get ahead, you had to stop by Frankie Carver and Blinky Baltimore. They controlled everything from the trainers, the managers, reporting journalists, using their combination of intimidation and financial backing. By 1959, Carver and his partner, Blinky Baltimore, owned a majority interest in the contract of heavyweight Sonny Liston. Liston went on to win the World Heavyweight Champion in 1962. Liston fought 12 fights in total under Carver and Blinky. According to the Washington Times old FBI documents, the feds suspected that the 1964 fight between Muhammad Ali, at the time Cassius Clay, and Sonny Liston was rigged. The fight was supposed to be the toughest fight of Cassius Clay's career, as Liston was regarded as one of the greatest fighters in the history of the sport. The FBI suspected that a guy named Ash Resnick, a Las Vegas gambler with organized crime connections, had something to do with Sonny Liston. This was an FBI memo presented back on May 24th, 1966 privately to J. Edgar Hoover. This detailed a meeting that Ash Resnick had with a Houston gambler who described to agents his discussions with Resnick before the first Cassius Clay fight with Sonny Liston. Barnett told the FBI that Resnick strongly advised him against betting on Liston to win the fight. The reports also reveal that Resnick and Liston both reportedly made over $1 million betting against Liston in the fight. Let's point out that Cassius Clay converted to Islam just weeks before the fight. There were also rumors on the opposite side that Cassius Clay was told by the Muslims to throw the fight away after converting to Islam. Ash Resnick was a Brooklyn native who had actually played ball at New York University and was involved in the fixing scandal there in the early 1950s. The 1972 FBI report stated that Resnick was involved in Caesar's Palace and was close with NBA Hall of Famer Wilt Chamberlain. He was deeply connected to Wilt Chamberlain during the 68-69 season, in which Wilt performed poorly. The FBI investigated Wilt Chamberlain in the late 1960s because of the rumors that he was fixing his own games.
It's not my thing. What about this?
What do you want me to say? Go ahead, try and sell it. You want to be a dumpster?
When Sonny Liston passed away in 1970 from what was pronounced as a heroin overdose in his Las Vegas home, conspiracies flew around that Liston's mob ties eventually caught up to him. Some of Liston's closest friends said that he would never ever use heroin because he was terrified of needles. Before Liston became a heavyweight champ, he carried out a series of robberies, muggings, and ended up being sentenced to 5 years in prison. It was there, in prison, where Liston would receive 3 meals a day in prison boxing programs as well. Upon his release from prison, Liston turned to boxing, and that's why he was involved with the mob, because he wasn't able to get these big fights on his own. So the mob was able to create fights for Sonny Liston because they knew how to flex their muscles. This is when Sonny Liston sold his soul to the mob. Mobsters were attracted to Liston because of his talent and power, especially in his left jab. Liston had no other choice because John Vidal, Liston's manager, was a mob boss, and Liston needed him to continue his boxing career. Without the backing of his wealthy manager, Vidal, Liston would have likely ended up back in prison. Liston was transferred from John Vidal's stable in St. Louis to Philly, eventually, where he would be managed by the mob combo Frankie Carver and Blinky Palomar. This is where Sonny Liston's career took off immediately. Sonny began to accumulate knockout victories one by one. But after his second Ali fight, his career went downhill. During the time of his death, he was going broke as his earnings were schemed by the mob handlers. This is where he got into drug deals and made some appearances at Las Vegas casinos. Liston made many enemies during this time, and many people wanted him dead. He was under federal investigation. There was a drug dealer who he crossed and had a contract out for his life. Some people believe that Liston was bumped off by the mob because he was no use to the mob anymore after suffering some brutal knockouts. In January 1971, Liston's wife returned home after spending a few days with her mother. This is where she discovered the decaying remains of the former world heavyweight champion in the bedroom. He had been dead for almost a week.
Other dancers may
While Frankie Carver and Blinky Palomar continued to run the business behind the scenes in the boxing world, the feds started moving in closer on them, building a case for some substantial amount of time. Eventually, the grand jury investigation finally led to an indictment against Frankie Carver and Blinky Palomar. They both was charged with orchestrating the details of a matchup between Virgil Atkins and Isaac Lawgard, which was a semifinal of a tournament for the vacant welterweight title. When Carbo heard Blinky got picked up and there was a warrant out for him, he went on the run. He had reached Haddon Township in New Jersey, where he held up for nearly a whole year before the cops eventually arrested him. In order to avoid trial, Carbo pleaded to 3 counts of undercover managing and matchmaking. Carbo and Blinky were sentenced to 2 years in prison at Rikers Island. Then in 1960, Parlomo and Carbo was released from jail. Jack Lennon at the time was a Los Angeles boxing promoter, and one of his fighters' name was Don Jordan, a welterweight who in 1958 won the world heavyweight title, defeating Virgil Atkins as a 3-1 underdog. It was after Jordan Atkins Part 1, which Frankie Carver approached Lennon. Carver wanted a share in being Jordan's manager in his effort to muscle in and size a large percentage of his earnings from the fighter's contract and future bouts. Jack Lennon allegedly promised Carver and Blinky that Jordan's manager, Don Nissit, would cooperate with them if Jordan was given the decision in Part 2 of the Virgil Atkins and Jordan fight. Don Jordan ended up getting the decision, and Carver didn't get his share of Jordan as he was promised. Carver eventually told Lennon, "You're no good. Your word is no good. Nothing is good about you. Just because you live 2,000 miles away, that is no shame that I can have you taken care of. I have plenty friends out there that will take out punks like you." 2 weeks later, Lennon was hospitalized with a concussion after he had been attacked with a hammer inside his garage by 2 men. His home was also set on fire a few days later, but he wasn't home. Lennon then became a witness for the prosecution, who was building up another case to put Carver and Blinky in the joint for a longer time. Lennon told the prosecution that Carver had called him before the hearing and said he'll have his eyeballs torn out if he talked. In the 1961 trial, Lennon, under 24-hour police protection, testified that Carver had told him he controlled the boxing world for 25 years and no punk was going to take that away from him. This was a 3-month trial as top managers, trainers, promoters, and boxers were all called to the stand. Each day, the evidence was stacked up against Parlomo and Carver. With the help of Lennon's testimony, he was able to take down the Khazar of boxing, Frankie Carver, Blinky Parlomo, and the rest of his crew.
Other dancers may remember rhythms.
Of course, that's a Fugazi. Alright? That's a Fugazi. How do you know it's a Fugazi? You looked at it for 2 seconds. It's a fake. But yeah, I know what a Fugazi is. Hey, pal. You wanna see something?
when did organized crime get back into boxing?
Well, over a period of time recently, we've had an interest. Again, talking about my own family, going down to Gleason's gym, I met some fighters and tried to put something together. I had conversation with John Gotti and myself, and John had urged me to see if we can reach out and put together some possible gyms or promoters or fights and see if we can get back involved in the boxing industry. In that period, I found out that we would be able to reach certain people who are rather successful in the boxing industry.